Hey, Bill Watson here on the web for the Armor of God. Good to have all of you with us once again. You know, I've got a question for you today, and the question revolves around these scriptures. Matthew chapter 12, verse 8, and Mark chapter 2, 27, verse 28 or so. And what basically is said here is the fact that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I know many of you will say, well, so what is so wrong with that? Well, here's the question. What day is the Sabbath? And I know some of you will say, well, it's Sunday, of course. Many of you Christians observe it on Sunday because you say, well, the basic reason for that is because he ascended on Sunday. And I get that. I understand. Some of you will say, well, no, there's no special day at all that you have to keep. It's just as long as you keep one day a week, well, that satisfies pretty much the requirement. And it could be any day of the week, as long as it fits into conveniently my particular schedule. And I get all of those arguments, my friends. But you know what? It's interesting. Every scholar, there isn't probably one scholar that would argue this point. And that is, the Sabbath, contextually, in your Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is universally accepted as being defined as what the Jews keep, essentially, from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, meaning basically that Saturday is really the Sabbath day. And interestingly enough, in combination with that is Jesus Christ over here in Luke chapter 4, and I just want to bring your attention to this because this is interesting. Many people don't really give Jesus credit for this, but the fact of it is he came into Nazareth, his hometown, where he grew up. That's what it says here in verse 16 and in Luke chapter 4, and he states this. He comes to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, meaning Jesus Christ, his custom was the same as the Jews, because Jesus, of course, was a Jew, as many of you may know, maybe you don't know, but nevertheless, he was a Jew. And the Greek word means it was his habit. It was his manner. This was his way. This is how he was brought up, and he kept that Sabbath all the time. That's what he understood to be the Sabbath day as was defined. Over here, and let me take you to Acts chapter 17 as we read here about the travels of the disciples back some 25, 30 years after Christ ascended back to the Father. Here in chapter 17 and in verse 2, we read this. The Apostle Paul, of all things, we're told, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. So here we see, again, the same word, translated manner, translated over there, custom. The point being, it was the way of Paul, and it was the way of Christ to keep this Saturday Sabbath, as some would call, or as others might say, essentially, the tradition of this Jewish holy day, this Jewish weekly Sabbath day. And we could go through the book of Acts even more often here in other scriptures, like in Acts chapter 18 and verse 4, where Paul says, because some of you may argue the point, well, hey, Bill, now wait a minute. Okay, I get the fact that all these Jews are keeping this Saturday, but that didn't apply to the Gentiles. Oh, yes, it did. Over here in Acts chapter, just one page over, and in chapter 18, roughly, we see here Paul meeting up with a couple of friends, Aquila and Priscilla, and it says here in verse 4, he reasoned, this is the Apostle Paul again, let me bring your attention to this, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded, look at this now, the Jews and the Greeks, meaning the Greeks were going to the synagogue to hear Paul preach on the Sabbath day. That's right, my friends. He was teaching this fact that the Sabbath day was applicable not only to those early Jewish Christians, but it was applicable to those early Greek Christians as well. And these were the early traditions that the early embryonic Church of God kept, observed, and adhered to on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, I don't know how many of you recognize this or not, But there is a narrative over in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, and I strongly suggest that for those of you who say that the Sabbath is not addressed in the New Testament, oh, it is. As a matter of fact, on my King James Bible here at the top of the page, it actually identifies the heading of these scriptures, this narrative we find about the Sabbath day of all things in chapter 3 and 4, because you got to go back to chapter 3 in order to get the context of chapter 4. But essentially the heading says right here, the Christian rest. It's all about the Christian rest. And the writer of Hebrews, many people believe it was the Apostle Paul, actually takes the opportunity to lay out some history, grabbing some of the imagery from the Old Testament, bringing it forward, talking about how those early Israelites were not allowed to go into the rest of God. As a matter of fact, they had to find out some very hard lessons in what was called the wilderness for 40 years. Many of you may have heard these stories in Sunday school at your local church denominational meeting place, where they were taught that those Israelites, because they sinned against God, and this is brought up in chapter 3, basically were prevented from going into the promised land, which was characterized, of all things, characterized as God's rest. And in chapter 3 over here, the subject begins to change more specifically toward this subject that we're talking about. And it says here, wherefore, I was grieved with that generation, talking about those Israelites that ended up in the wilderness for 40 years and were prevented from going into the promised land. He was grieved with that generation and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So, he says, I swore in my anger, God says here, they shall not enter into my rest. And that was a characterization, an allegory of the promised land, of which Israel was destined to ultimately get to, but the point being, these particular people, because of their sins, were not allowed to enter. Verse 17 now, chapter 3, book of Hebrews, we read this, but with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom swore he that they should not enter into, and here's the word rest again, used as that allegory of the promised land being that rest they were not allowed to go to, but to them that believed not. They were not allowed to go because they did not believe. So we see that they could not enter in because they lacked faith, because of unbelief. That's the way chapter 3 ends. Chapter 4, this was a letter. There's no real chapters. The translators did that. But nevertheless, chapter 4, verse 1, he goes on and he says this. So he makes a little change, a little adjustment. He says, therefore, let us fear, we Christians, because now he's bringing it into our timeline. He's done talking about the history lesson of the ancient Israelites in the 40 years in the wilderness that were not allowed to go into the promised land. Now he's bringing it forward to us and talking to us specifically, us Christians. He says, therefore, let us fear, us Christians, lest a promise being left to us, Christians, of entering into his rest. He's still drawing this theme of this rest. Any of you should seem to come short of it. He doesn't want us to fail in entering the rest. For unto us was the gospel preached, see, we're talking about Christians here, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them. They lacked unbelief. He says here, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my anger, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. So he goes on and he says, for he spoke in a certain place, notice this now, of the seventh day. So now he's bringing the seventh day into this allegory, into this analogy, because there is a purpose for doing that, because the seventh day represents a short-term element of expression for faith, of Christians or for Christians to observe and to keep in honor of His rest. You're going to see that here in a moment as we continue on here. He says in this, for He spoke in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all His works, and in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. Seeing therefore, He says, because God rested, it remains that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Going back, that they were not entering in even to this rest, this seventh day rest, because of unbelief. He goes on. Again, He limits a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts. For if Joshua, not Jesus, that's kind of a mistranslation because we're still referencing that Old Testament, it's Joshua, had given them rest, they would not have afterward spoken of another day. And there was another day, the kingdom of God in the long term, but in the short term, notice this, watch, it goes on in verse 9, therefore there remains a rest, or the more proper Greek translation, a keeping of the Sabbath for the people of God. Interesting. Chapter 4, Hebrews, verse 9. So the analogy is for the short term, this Sabbath day entrance, keeping it, observing it, holding it honorable above all the other 6 days, is a short term, what you could say, reflection of your attitude toward God that measures your commitment and sense of dedication to God's rest that He did, identifying you with the Creator God. And not doing it obviously cuts that tether. And that's what this writer is getting to. So he goes on here at verse 10, for he that is entered into his rest, and that is God's rest because He rested on the seventh day after the creation, He also has ceased from His own works as God did from His. And if you do that, you are identifying with the Creator God and connecting right up to Him. Let us labor, therefore let us labor to enter into the rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. And what does that mean, essentially, is that those that don't keep the Sabbath, quite frankly and bluntly, are lacking belief as far as God is concerned, because observing Sabbath day is a short-term reflection of your desire to get into the long-term rest of God's kingdom. There's so much I could say on this subject, my friends, but in the meantime, go ahead and just hit us on our website at cgi.org and get this particular free offer that I have to present to you on this little short vignette. Who changed the Sabbath to Sunday then? Who changed the Sabbath to Sunday? And that is certainly a legitimate question for all of us to ask, that if indeed Christ didn't change it, if indeed that early embryonic church never did leverage a modification to it, well then the question is, and we have this article titled, Who Changed the Sabbath to Sunday? Go ahead, as I said, hit us on our website at www.cgi.org or download it off of our app, our CGI website app. You can get it at any Google and or Apple app store for your convenience that you can download. My friends, this is Bill Watson on the web for the Armor of God. The Church of God International would like to introduce the availability of a new app designed for your convenience. Download it now.